Son's resurrection, and enable that then through the power of your Spirit to enkindle a fire in our hearts to live out your gospel authentically. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus the Lord.
Amen.
Okay, so I have our final handout that we built for the last few classes. This will cover all of the resurrection accounts in the Gospels and Acts, except for Paul, who I am not going to include. We've talked about this before. But we finally reached the point where we can look at the narratives themselves and begin to discuss and see what happened. What we're going to find is a couple things as we go, this is going around, a couple things. The first is right from the very beginning with the first accounts of the empty tomb, which are covered by all four Gospels. There's going to be variations all over the place. Who the women were, whether they ever went in the tomb or not, whether Jesus even appeared to them or not, how many there were, who told them Jesus was raised from the dead. We're going to find all kinds of variations. But for the most part, a lot of those are easy to focus, just to look at as differences as we see them today regarding eyewitness testimony. The second one's more difficult, and we're going to actually start with a little story that occurs before the resurrection, but has connections to the resurrection, to kind of point out that sometimes the stories have differences that are so different from each other that in truth we can't do anything except just let them sit and they remain a mystery. And so as we've been looking, and as you see in the handout here, once again I start by just stating the creed that we find in St. Paul, which, remember, this creed goes back all the way to within 2 to 3 years of Jesus' resurrection, so it's ancient. And so for the most part, we're going to use the chronology that Paul gives us here, the order of the appearances as we look at them. However, when we turn to the Gospels and we compare it to this creed and some of the other creed-like forms we see in the Bible, there's going to be big discrepancies as well, though. So, for instance, St. Paul does not refer to all of the resurrection accounts that are given to us in the Gospels, specifically the women, and he doesn't refer to the apostles of Emmaus. Similarly, the resurrection accounts do not have all the information that Paul gives us. There are no actual specific appearances that we have of James, the 500, or those other apostles who are not the 12. And so for those, I've kind of placed them in the order of which they probably occur, but it's sometimes hard to figure out because you only have one small bit of information containing it. But we're going to start by looking at something that I just call here on page 1 an odd beginning, because it is a strange story. And I only included it because to deal with it in the beginning, because I didn't want someone to ask me halfway through and then I get sidetracked. So we have this weird story. Only Matthew has it. When it comes to the resurrection things, Matthew's kind of the pain in the butt. He has 3 stories that no one else has. No one else even alludes to. And his stories aren't just nice details. They change the whole story of the resurrection appearances. And so they're difficult. He's the only one who tells us that the tomb was guarded and sealed. No one else does. He's the only one who tells us that an angel actually appeared from heaven at the moment the women got there and himself opened the tomb in front of them. No one else tells us that. And he refers to this section, which is perhaps the oddest of all. So we'll just look at it. We'll give our best shot because the church has no teaching. It's never even tried to understand this first, this kind of lead up story. So we're taken back actually to where Jesus is on the cross. So 3 days before the resurrection, we have the moment of the crucifixion and death. So it says, from noon onward, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And Jesus' statement there. But let's just go right to his death. Jesus cried again in a loud voice and gave up his spirit. And behold, the veil of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth quaked, rocks were split, tombs were opened, And the bodies of many saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and coming forth from their tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. The centurion and the men with him who were keeping watch over Jesus feared greatly when they saw the earthquake and all that was happening, and they said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Okay, so we got all kinds of stuff no one even mentions. And these are big things. If hundreds of dead people are walking around, you think one of the other three might have said something about it, right? And that's why we find ourselves in a difficult place here. Now, that being said, we're going to see we'll point out there's other places in the New Testament outside the Gospels that have similar odd statements. And so Matthew's connecting us to something that happened. What most scholars have taken the sort of track in over the centuries of looking at this story is they've seen that Matthew is combining both historical events of that moment, and he's intertwining it. So he's combining the event of the Paschal mystery, the death and resurrection of Christ, and into his story, he's clearly weaving it into these prophetic fulfillments, things that the prophecies were all pointing towards that help us understand kind of and explain Jesus's death. And so he's got this mix going between the two of what's happening at this moment. And so we have this thing where first he tells us that there's an earthquake at the moment Jesus dies. It's not clear, even in the Greek, if the earthquake is the cause of the tombs opening, probably the way it's written, and probably also the cause of the ripping and tearing of the temple veil. The temple veil one's easy, and some of the other gospel authors do record that. And so that one we'll go to first because we can handle that one. That one's not a strange thing. He just connects it to these other things, which none of the other authors do. The temple was had different precincts in it, and so that this precinct wasn't really even a formal precinct. It was one that was added to the temple later, and it's called the Court of Women. So if you were a female Israelite, you could go no further than here. That's as far as you could ever get into the temple, which means you never entered the building itself ever. Beyond this was the court of Gentiles. No Gentile, male or female, could pass beyond that on penalty of death, and Rome upheld that. In fact, we have the sign is in Jerusalem today. You can see it. The warning written in 3 languages to not pass beyond. So Rome actually upheld that rule. When you got to the temple itself, and you walked in, you had the court of Israelites. So that was for all males up to the age or 12 and older. Any younger males had to remain in the court of women with their mother. And generally just because of size and numbers. Usually when a family would travel there, you'd only, at the most, would be 2 men from the family. Dad and his oldest son. That's why you see that symbolically in the scriptures within the group of Jesus, because who does he send to prepare the Passover meal? We're told Jesus sends 2 of the apostles, and I remember who? Peter, who's like the father of them, and John, who's the firstborn, the best one. And so you would walk in. There was a huge basin for water that the priests, and only the priests, washed themselves and prepared. The sacrifice, the altar was outside. There are actually 2 altars, but the one that you sacrificed animals on was outside. A lot of people don't realize that. And so the animal sacrifice, everything took place out here. And then you had the building that was the tabernacle proper, the tabernacle. And within the tabernacle were 2 rooms. There was the holy place, and there you have the little table with the showbread, the 12 loaves of bread that were changed every Saturday and eaten by the priest, and only they were allowed to eat them. And you had the menorah, the light, which also was a symbol that it's carved to look like the tree of life. So the temple everywhere was designed to look like Eden. It was Eden in miniature. And then you had the holiest of holies, where the Ark of the Covenant had once been kept. Once. There was no Ark in the time of Jesus in there. It was an empty room. But it was still kept there as a part of just the understanding of what was happening. Now, there were two curtains in the entire structure. The first one was a blue curtain that separated the outside from entering the tabernacle itself. The inner curtain was a red curtain, and that separated the Holy of Holies from everywhere else. So what you had was there were constant lines of segregation, literally. Gentiles to women, to male Israelites 12 and older, to, at the sacrificial area, the Levites, who are not priests, right? They're the equivalent of deacons back then. Then the priests could pass through into this area, but into this area, only one man, the high priest, was ever allowed in, and only one day out of the entire year. No one else, even other priests, would never have seen the inside of the Holy of Holies. So you have these things. Now, the curtain that they're speaking about that tears is this one. This is the one that's torn, separating where God should be present, although technically he wasn't because there's no ark, but that's where God's presence was going to be. And this has a dual meaning. You'll have to jump ahead a little bit because I'm going to do this first to go back and then cover the more weird one. If you go to page 5, the second full paragraph, and you'll see numbers 1 and 2. The tearing of the temple veil has a positive and a negative meaning to it. On the one hand, it has a negative meaning, at least for ethnic Israel, because the tearing of the temple veil signifies that God has profaned his own temple. He has allowed what's supposed to be hidden and remain sacred and secluded and kept that way open to the elements and everyone else. And so negatively, what it's basically saying is that what it meant to the early Christians was the temple sacrifices are done. Right? The temple is no longer the place where God dwells. And in fact, Jesus had told us not much earlier, it'll soon be destroyed. Soon, 70 years, but 40 years. But so the temple is gone. That's the only way you can understand why Paul, who otherwise, even in his Christianness, is a super Orthodox Jew. It's the only way you can understand his statement that the sacrifices in the temple are made to demons, not God. For him, it's completely been reversed. So that's one meaning, is the temple is no longer the place of God's presence, the Jerusalem temple. Second, positively, it means that now every person is granted immediate access to the Father through Jesus. Sometimes we forget that part of it. Not through us. I don't have any immediate access to the Father. I have it only in and through the power of the Spirit through Jesus. And so it's always, all my prayers, everything has to be in, through Jesus and the Spirit. The Mass is the model of all prayer. Every prayer said in the Mass, except 2 of them, are to the Father. Not to the Trinity, to the Father. And it's all said in and united with Jesus, which is the only way that the Father will deign to hear our prayers, united to the Son. And the only reason we can even be united to the Son is because of the Spirit we've called down to be with us to make it present. So it's that same understanding, but the idea that all this is gone now, right? Any of the different degrees and levels, it's all gone. And that's why Paul, using him again, will later say, in Jesus Christ, there is no Jew or Gentile, male or female, all are there. So the tearing of the temple really shows that the whole new age has begun. That something very different in how God is now dealing with both Israel and all of humanity has come about. In short, what the temple was, Jesus is now for everyone. And since Jesus in his ascended glory can be anywhere and everywhere, that's why there's no single place or temple that God dwells in, but he dwells anywhere. So every Catholic church, we have the tabernacle. If Rome were destroyed tomorrow, it wouldn't end the church, because Rome is not the equivalent that Jerusalem was to the ancient world. So I'm not saying that would be a good thing, but I'm just saying the church would exist apart from that. So now let's go back to the weirder one. The bodies walking around and all this kind of stuff going on of what's happening. Well, 4 passages that Matthew has alluded to already, or even briefly summarized in his gospel already up to this point, is he has 4 passages from different prophets. The first one I didn't give you because it's quite long. I gave you the note for it. It's Exodus chapter 37, verses 1 through 14. I'll turn there real quick. In Exodus 37, or excuse me, Ezekiel, not Exodus. Ezekiel 37 and 36, we have a 3-part, 3-step process Ezekiel points out for us. Ezekiel is writing, he's a priest, he's a prophet. Israel has already been exiled, and he is now writing the prophet to write to the exiles. It's not all over. And here's what will happen as God returns. And so in chapter 36, the first 15 verses of the chapter, he talks about the land and how it's becoming renewed and regenerated. So the land of Israel itself, God first comes in and starts working with the land. Then the second step is verses 16 to the end of chapter 36, where now the restoration of the kingdom and such is beginning. And then finally with chapter 37, which is where what Matthew is really drawing on, we have a story. It's a famous one. Most people at least have heard of it, where he has the vision of the dry bones, the field of bones. And so Isaiah says, "The hand of the Lord came upon me, and he led me out in spirit of the Lord and set me in the center of the broad valley. It was filled with bones. He made me walk among them in every direction. So many lay on the surface of the valley, how dry they were. He asked me, 'Son of man, how can these bones come back to life?' Lord God answered, 'You alone know that.' Then he said, 'Prophesy.'" And so he tells Isaiah to prophesy over the bone and let the flesh come back, and they do. It's this weird story where he sees them reconnect themselves, all the tissues grow back and everything, but they're all still dead. And then when he's confused as to why they're still dead, then God says, "Well, now you need to prophesy over them that only my breath returns them to life." And so he prophesies and returns, the Spirit of God comes on them, and you have this this experience happen. He talks about the breath entered them, they came to life, they stood on their feet, the vast army. This is what Israel once said, "Our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off." But say to them, "I am going to open your graves. I will make you come out of my graves, your graves, my people, and I will bring you back to the land again. You'll know that I, the Lord, am Lord when I open your graves and bring you out back of them, my people." And so we have this one statement. And here we have the specific allusion to the graves of only certain people being opened. He refers to the holy ones, the saints. So not everybody, but certain people experience this, what Jesus does, sort of immediately, it seems, that he's trying to imply. That's one. There's 3 more to look at. The second one comes from Isaiah, and it starts at the bottom, page 2, and carries over. And it's similar. Both of these are exilic, post-exilic prophecies. That is, they're directed to the people who are living in exile after the kingdom has already been destroyed, the temple's been destroyed, and they've kind of lost their hope. And he says, "Lord, oppressed by your punishment, we cried out in anguish under your discipline. As a woman about to give birth writhes and cries out in pain, so were we before you, Lord. We conceived and writhed in pain, giving birth only to wind. Salvation we have not achieved for the earth, for no inhabitants for the world were born." Now this is interesting because what Isaiah is telling us in this prophecy is what we've been discussing all along. Israel understood itself to be the new Adam. It understood the promised land to be the new Eden. It understood the tabernacle to be the presence of God amidst them, just as he was with Adam and Eve in the garden. And they know that their vocation was to bring the light of Yahweh to the world. And that's what they're admitting now. They know why they're being punished. Because notice how they say it. We conceived and writhed in pain, but we gave birth only to win. It's a play on words. God's spirit raises everything from the dead. Man's spirit doesn't achieve anything. Empty. And so we have not achieved for the earth. Salvation we have not achieved for the earth. No inhabitants for the world were born. We failed. We know, Lord, we failed. We have not been who we were meant to be. We have not saved the earth. We couldn't even save ourselves. And yet, despite all that, despite of the failure, this is what God says to them. But your dead shall rise, their corpses shall live, their corpses shall rise. Awake and sing, you who lie in the dust, for your dew is the dew of light, and you cause the land of shades to give birth. So the poetic way of Sheol is going to disgorge its inhabitants. They're going to rise up again. Now, the third one then comes from Daniel. We've seen this one a few times. It's actually the first time that resurrection is ever mentioned in the entire Bible. And it's found right in the middle of page 3, the italicized part. And after everything has occurred and the Messiah has come, Daniel says this, or Daniel is told this by the prophet, the angel Gabriel. At that time there shall arise Michael, the angel Michael, the great prince, guardian of your people. Shall be a time unsurpassed in distress since the nation began until that time. At that time your people shall escape, everyone who is found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, others to reproach and everlasting disgrace. Here, not only do we have the raising of the dead, but here Matthew is drawing on one specific thing. In Daniel's statement, not everyone is raised from the dead. Do you notice that? Many, not all. And the many is interesting. It's not who we would necessarily expect entirely. It's the best of the best, the holiest, that we would expect. But it's also the worst of the worst. All the, quote, mediocre, they're not raised. Why? So the best can be rewarded and the worst can be punished. They didn't get away with it. So they're literally brought back to life simply so God can say, sorry, I'm God, not you. You don't get to check out after your life of sin. You think it's over. But the fact that not everybody is raised, at least at this point, Daniel never says anything else. So as far as he was concerned, there wasn't a resurrection of every person. There was only some. That's where Matthew's drawing the fact that, notice he tells us only those of the saints were raised. And so he's kind of following along these different prophecies to tell us what's happening at the moment Jesus came. The last one now comes from the passage of Zechariah. And in the passage of Zechariah, we see a story of God and his final victory over the enemies of the world, so he can restore the world to what it is meant to be. So he says at the bottom of page 3, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoils taken from you will be divided in your midst, and I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem for battle. The city will be taken, the houses will be plundered, women raped, half the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be removed. So he's describing to Zechariah something that's already happened. And that was the end of Jerusalem. But at some time later, the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations. Fighting is on a day of battle. On that day, the Lord God's feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is opposite Jerusalem to the east. The Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west by a very deep valley, and half the mountain will move to the north and half to the south. And it becomes almost like an earthly Red Sea. As the mountain splits, Israel's to flee in between it, and all the nations that follow are going to be crushed. So it's kind of this symbolic experience of salvation. Thus you will flee as you fled because of the earthquake in the days of King Uzziah, king of Judah. So there you have the earthquake mentioned that Matthew tells us about. Then the Lord my God will come and all his holy ones with him. And on that day, like you have the image of the Spirit, the fresh water that flows from Jerusalem to water the whole earth. And so we've got all these images that Matthew is invoking or evoking. It's interesting because the Mount of Olives is actually an important place in the Hebrew story. It's almost the exact same elevation as Zion. And so you can literally look, you can stand on the Mount of Olives, and in the days of Jesus, you could look directly to the temple and see it. And that's why the Mount of Olives is always where God pronounces judgment on his people. And so in this story, in the one from Zechariah, you saw that God from the Mount of Olives pronounces judgment, and then he saves the righteous, but all the unfaithful Israelites are destroyed. Well, Ezekiel has a similar story, but he talks about before the temple is destroyed the first time in 538 BC by the Babylonians. Ezekiel has an image, a vision of the cloud of glory, the Shekinah, the cloud of God's presence. He sees it leaving the temple, and it goes and it sits on the top of the Mount of Olives, Mount Olivet. And from there it pronounces judgment on the city, and then soon afterwards the city is going to be destroyed. Well, if you go, Matthew knows this as well. If you have your Bible with you, in the days just immediately preceding Jesus' resurrection and death, if you go to chapter 24 of Matthew, so he's in Jerusalem now. This is during his last week before his arrest, his crucifixion, and the resurrection. And remember, they take a little walk through the outer part of the temple. And we're told Jesus left the temple area, was going away when his disciples approached him to point out the temple buildings. So they're all in awe from the temple. And it was an amazing thing. It was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. So they're pointing it all out. It was huge, too. I don't think people realize it. If you've seen the Colosseum in Rome, 5 fit in the temple. 5 would have fit in the temple. Very easy. The temple was enormous. You get a sort of a glimpse of it from the wall, but if you've ever seen aerial pictures of Jerusalem, the foundations are still there after all these 2,000 years. You can see it where it was. So, yeah, it was enormous. So they're pointing all these out, and Jesus says to them, "You see all these things, do not? Amen, I say to you, there will not be left here a stone upon another stone that will not be thrown down." So it's going to be destroyed. And then, typical Jesus, he says something cool, and then he leaves, right? So, notice verse 3. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, he's Yahweh. So he goes and he sits where God is going to pronounce judgment. They're going to ask him about the destruction of the temple, the end of Israel, so he's going to tell them from there. The problem is, and we find this wrapped throughout all the stories, because later we'll have to, one of the images that also has this pre-resurrection of certain people is found in John's Gospel, or John's Revelation. And the problem with John's Revelation is that you have John is recounting 4 different events within one book. And this is why John is difficult to read, because he mixes together without ever telling us how to separate 4 events that he's narrating. The Jewish War, which occurred in 66 to 70 AD, the persecution of Nero, which was the first great persecution of the church. But John lived through that one, I think we forget that. So he's not just telling us history when he writes. He's writing at the time of his own emperor's persecution, Domitian. And then, of course, he's telling about the end of the world. So the problem for exegetes is not that we, at least in the Catholic world, we have to have something straight. We know what all the symbols mean, okay? Just because the evangelical world wants to make them all into modern ideas and stuff and don't understand it, we know what all the symbols mean because they're all biblical. That's not the problem. The problem is we don't know which events that are symbolized there apply to which things. Some of them apply to all four. Some only apply to three. Some only apply to two. Some only apply to one. We don't know. And so that's where the difficulty lies. But don't blame John. It's Jesus' fault. And you see it right here. What were they just talking about? The destruction of the temple, right? Verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples approached him privately and said, "Tell us, when will this happen?" What's this? Destruction of the temple. "And what sign will there be of your coming and of the end of the age?" That's 3 questions. And so Jesus answers. And guess what? He does the same thing that John does. We have no idea from verse 4 on what follows applies to this or Jesus coming or the end of the world. No idea. So because of that, it's always difficult to gauge what a lot of these statements are and these teachings and put them in their specific historical context. I mean, nearly everything Jesus says following that statement happened in 66 AD, almost everything. But clearly the last parts didn't. The Son of Man didn't come, all these different things. And in this section, probably just from memory, you may remember, there's wars, rumors of wars, there's earthquakes. So all these apocalyptic images of earthquakes and graves opening up and everything else, that Matthew just seems to be drawing on all that understanding. Now, as I mentioned, though, although it'd be easy to just look at Matthew and say, he just made it up. In other words, this is just a fable that's supposed to teach us some lesson. The problem is in at least 2 other books in the Bible, Hebrews and Revelation, we have a similar statement. So clearly this was a tradition of the early church that wasn't only Matthew's, and it comes from very different places. You have it in John, who writes completely different than Matthew. You have it in the book of Hebrews, which is a Hebrew writing. You have Matthew, who's a Hebrew writing to a Gentile church. And so you have it across all the streams of tradition, and the statements there are almost just as weird and hard to sort of pin down. But real briefly, we'll just look at a couple things. One, back to page 5. The first thing to realize is Matthew is writing. It's notoriously difficult to have scholars agree on anything. I mean, that's just the truth. That's why God didn't put scholars in charge of the church. He put bishops. Whether we like that or not sometimes, in the end, it works out way better. The scholarship is constantly changing, right? But generally speaking, we have a good idea of when these texts were written. And so generally speaking, Mark is believed to have been written between 60 to 65 AD, Matthew between 65 to 75 AD, Luke between 75 and 85, and John later. Now, all of Paul's letters are written between 51 and 62. So with the possible exception of Mark, which most people date at the higher end, everything Paul wrote existed before any gospel was ever written down. Jesus died and rose, we believe, AD 33. So I simply point out this. When Matthew is writing, at a minimum, he's writing 30 years after the fact. He was an eyewitness of the resurrection. He was not an eyewitness of this, because he was hiding in a room, right? The other 11 to escape persecution of Jesus' arrest. Matthew knows there's no dead people walking around in his time. Right? He knows that. He's not an idiot. So he's talking about some very brief and odd event. he also gives us a little bit of a clue himself, which when we read it, we probably missed it. But if you go back and look at what Matthew actually says, is at the bottom of page 1 to 2. But go to the page 2. So Jesus dies. Jesus gives up his spirit. Behold, the veil of the sanctuary was torn in two. So the moment Jesus dies, the veil rips. The earthquake. So there's an earthquake at the same time. Rocks were split. Tombs were opened. Okay. But then notice the next verse. Or not the next verse yet. The bodies of many saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and coming forth from their tombs when? After his resurrection. So it didn't occur right then. Even he himself admits. There was no dead people walking around in the 3 days in between. It happened after Jesus rose. Without getting into all the other ones, only take us into weird directions too. I'll mention them so you know where they are. But to wrap this up so we can actually get to the resurrection, this is the best the church has ever been able to do, in my opinion. By the Middle Ages, they determined, we do know from the letters of Peter and Jude, that Jesus, when he died, he went into Sheol, the place of the dead. We sometimes call it hell, but you have to realize it's not hell, the place of the damned, it's the place of the dead. And he emptied Sheol of the righteous dead, right? That was his promise. We know that. That's in there. What we believe Matthew is recounting, but he's placed it in the context of the resurrection to show, and death to show us that this is connected to Jesus' paschal mystery, is, so to speak, on their way to heaven for the first time. Some made appearances, not appearances in that they were bodily raised already, but people saw them as they went back. It's the best the church can do. Like it or don't, that's fine. You can come up with your own. Because there is no teaching. The church won't even touch this one. They're like, you gotta be kidding. No way. And so that's the best we can do. I think that one actually makes sense, where Matthew is placed at a certain time, but even in placing it, he admits it happened after that time, an event that we can sort of point to with more definitiveness of Jesus going to the place of the dead and bringing those with him. Now, just for fun, so you can hurt your brain someday, the other ones come from, one is Resurrection, the Apocalypse, chapter 20, and it's actually on page 7 in a footnote. It's in footnote 22. It says, John has a phrase, the first resurrection. Here we have another difficulty. And here's John again giving us language found nowhere else. So, first of all, John speaks of the first death and a second death. And it's only in his book of Revelation. And then he speaks of a first resurrection and a second resurrection. Now, actually, once you see John's symbolism, it's easy to grasp what he's doing. But then he throws us this wrench. But in general, what's the first death? Well, that's when we die physically. Right? So then what would the second death be? Right, that's eternal death, which only some will experience. That's the second death. The second resurrection is the resurrection. That's the resurrection in glory to live in the kingdom. Now, the way that John presents the first resurrection, and the church has always understood it this way, and in every single verse he uses the statement or symbol, it's clear that this fits in. This is the only one that it also fits in, but is weird. But what he generally means is the moment of baptism. Right? At the moment of baptism, the resurrection power takes over your life. The seed is planted, right? You get that in Paul and a lot of ideas. The new life has begun. As long as you don't mess it up, these are intertwined. They're intertwined. Now we get to this one verse, which does fit this, but it's also just an odd one. Here's what he says. I quote it in verse 22, or footnote 22. He says, quote, chapter 20, there were those who came to life and they reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were over. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over these. And he moves on. Right? No explanation, nothing. And so it's the only time, now this fits into that, but this is the only time he clearly specifies that there's a time at which some will be raised from the dead before others. The ones who are raised, by the way, which I don't include the whole chapter, are the martyrs. In other words, those most deserving because of their death, up to death for Jesus. So we have this weird statement, but notice, like Matthew, he seems to allude that there are some who get a special gift of resurrection in some way prior. The last one is comes from the letter to the Hebrews, and it starts on page 5, and we're not going to go through it. I gave it the whole quote, but it's just too long. But what the sacred author of Hebrews does here is the sacred author is using the example of all the Old Testament saints, the holy people of the Old Testament, as pointers and things to Christ. And so I'm not going to actually quote the thing. If you go to page 6, I give you 4 kind of footnotes or 4 hash marks that kind of point out some interesting things. The first one has to do with Isaac's birth. Isaac, who's the son of Abraham, the promised child, the one through whom all the promises will come. And Abraham's an old man, right? We all know the basic story. And so the author writes, and it always starts with the same refrain, by faith, and then they'll go forward. So speaking about how this guy could possibly have a child, it says, quote, by faith, he received power to generate, even though he was past the normal age. And Sarah herself was sterile, for he thought that the one who had made the promise was trustworthy, God. So it was that there came forth from one man, himself as good as dead, descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and countless as the sands on the seashore. So we have our first sort of pointing, and as the author goes through his collage of saints, they get more and more explicit. So notice he starts to use resurrection language of Abraham simply from the very beginning of Israel's history, right? From the very birth of Israel, because Isaac will be the father of Jacob. Jacob is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. So here, right at the very beginning, the calling of Abraham, the first step in the promise towards having all these descendants, comes forth by basically God raising a man and a woman who are dead, sexually speaking, at least being able to bear children, to give new life. And so we start to see these resurrection statements. The second one is interesting too. You have on page 7, the first hash mark, you have the binding and offering of Isaac, the Akedah. We know the story. That's when God is told, to offer your son. And, the test is ultimately, if God has said everything's coming through Isaac, and now he's dead, then in what way will God be able to fulfill his promises to you? This is, and as a lot of saints and mystics have written since, God's going to ask the same of everyone. What they mean by that is they're going to ask you to kill your child. What they're going to say is this: are you willing to put to death the blessings in life God has given you, if needed, to prove that you actually love him more than for what he gives you? Are you willing to lose all and keep him? Or if he gives you all but you miss him, you lost the point, right? What does it matter if you gain the whole world and lose your soul? Jesus says. And so all of us will have the Abraham moment in our lives. Some of us have already had it. Some will have it later. Some will have it multiple times, where God will say, who do you love? Do you love me for me, or do you love me for giving you stuff? And if it's just for giving you stuff, then you don't know me at all. And so that's what happens to Abraham. But so Abraham goes, and again, we have that same pattern. By faith, Abraham, when put to the test, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was ready to offer his only son, of whom it was said, to Isaac descendants shall bear your name. Right? In other words, he realized he's giving up everything God has promised him. He reasoned. Now this is interesting. The author tells us what Abraham's thought process was. Why was he willing to do this? Right? Why was he willing? Clearly it was out of character from the God he knew. Abraham had been a believer in God by this time well over 20, 30 years. Never had God done anything like this. So it clearly was out of character. What was Abraham thinking? Here's what the author tells us. He reasoned that God was able to raise even from the dead. And he received Isaac back as a symbol. Isaac becomes the image of what Jesus will be. And if you remember the rest of the story, what happens right afterwards? God stops Abraham. He sees the lamb caught within the thicket of thorns. And he offers it up, we're told in Genesis, in place of his son. Right? It's all the story of Jesus, the whole story. But again, Abraham's idea that God could have raised Isaac back from the dead. And when he receives Isaac back, he receives him as a symbol of that. Abraham finally grasped the power of God. And it's from this point onwards that whenever anyone dies, we have the weird phrase, they went to their fathers. Abraham finally grasped something that wasn't clear. And that's what Jesus will talk about later when he tells them, when he argues with the Sadducees who don't believe in life after death and say that the Torah never proved it. And he says, you don't read the Torah right, you don't understand the power of God. And so we have the author constantly going through these ideas. Other ones are, he talks about Joseph, who gives orders that his bones be brought back to Israel to be planted in the Holy Land and buried there, even though he lived his whole life in Egypt. And then you have the story of the woman, the mother, and her 7 sons who were all martyred. We call them the Maccabean brothers because they're in the book of Maccabees. We have to be careful because the Maccabees refer to the actual family of brothers who fought the war, which none of these people who were killed this way are. But what's interesting is what he says about them. The last hash tag, it says, the quote, women received their dead back their dead through resurrection. Now clearly the author doesn't think they were literally raised from the dead. He simply says that promise, that condition is made. And then a little further down in the next paragraph, there's that bold part, and then afterwards, I don't know why I didn't bold it, but I have an italicized part. Here's something else the author says that's interesting. Some were tortured and would not accept deliverance. They wouldn't let God save them at that point from physical death. Why wouldn't they do that? In order to obtain a better resurrection. What does that mean? Well, 2 things. One, it means they didn't want to settle for what happened to Lazarus, Jairus' daughter, and the widow from Nain. That's called a resurrection, but what did their resurrection entail? They're brought back to this life, and then they die again. And they go through any of the suffering and trials they would have gone through life. They want the real resurrection, right? Kill me, Lord. I'm okay with that. As long as by doing so, I secure the immortal resurrection that's coming. The second one may be tied into what John talks about of the 1,000 who come to life, or those who come to life earlier, and the fact that Matthew refers to them as saints, and that is those who do give up their bodies as the martyrs, they are the greatest in heaven. That's why there's no process for them. If you died for the faith, you are canonized. Period. We don't have to look at all your writings. We don't have to go through testimony, how many people thought you were holy. None of that. Because the church has always understood from these writings such that those who give the ultimate sacrifice and are literally conformed to the image of Christ by their blood, that denotes something special. So we've got all these weird stories. As I mentioned, the best we can do is probably the shades, the spirits of dead people on their way to heaven for the first time from Sheol. A few get to make some appearances, I guess, some stops. So, but in the end, we're left with a mystery. So don't ask me questions because I can't give you better.
I just missed the connection in the story of Joseph between that and resurrection. I know Jacob said he wanted
to bring him back to the land, and then Ezekiel tells us that it's going to be only in that valley in the land of Egypt where people will be raised, and that's why if any of you have been to Israel on Mount Olivet, there are a lot of tombs there from the centuries of Jesus and between. And that goes back to those aren't Christian tombs, those are Jewish tombs from those prophecies that your dead will rise. And so people actually wanted to be buried there and in the field of Megiddo near it. So you have the Mount of Olives and that to this day. So yeah, it's just, that's where Joseph's comes back. It's the return back to in him, you kind of have this image of he's returned to his promised land. He's dead, but he's raised up in Israel as part of the promise. He's still, yeah. That one's not quite as clear as the other ones. The other ones refer to resurrection. If that's what the author is probably going for when he mentions that one. Okay, so let's start with the first account. And the earliest appearances appears to be that of Mary Magdalene and or other women at or near the tomb of Jesus himself on the third day after Jesus' death. There is some dispute, though, about that. And the reason why, in the end, the dispute is not one of denial of who saw it first. It's simply who chronologically did this really occur to first. The Gospels, on the face of it, appear to say that the women are the first, to see Jesus. But as we're going to find out, of the four Gospels, only two of them say the women actually did see Jesus. They all saw angels, but only two, Matthew and John, only they said that the women saw anything of Jesus. The other two said they never saw anything but angels. So you already have half the evidence is gone. Second, the problem lies in that Peter is clearly recognized in the Corinthian Creed as being the first. Not only that, but Mark sets it out that when the angel sends the women, and in Mark there is no appearance to the women by Jesus, he makes a specification of Peter. Go to Peter and the other disciples and tell them they're going to each see me. Then you have Luke, who you have this great story, because you have the whole story of Emmaus, which it's bigger than almost any of the other resurrection stories. This great story, right? And what's probably a husband and wife. They've walked 7 miles with Jesus. They've eaten meals with him. They finally come to understand the breaking of bread. The moment it happens, he disappears. And so they run back, late at night, all the way back to Jerusalem to tell the 11. I mean, it's this great story. And then the story is so funny, though, because they rush in and they're so excited. They're like, we've seen Jesus. And this is the response. Yeah, we know. He already appeared to Peter. So, but notice, he appeared to Peter before them. And then, so you have this constant thing. And then the biggest one is John chapter 21. Everyone tells us that Jesus appeared to Peter, but there is no description directly of it, except John 21. People think that John 21, that John has taken it, and for whatever reason, and we'll look at it when we get to that story, John has juxtaposed, that is, he's taken it out of the place it should be, historically, chronologically, and he's placed it at the end in order to make a point. Now, the reason John's gospel is weird anyways is John's gospel, just real briefly, he's the only one who has 2 chapters on the resurrection. Everyone else has just one, the very last chapter. And John originally planned his that way. If you have your gospel, go to John real briefly just to look at this. And in John chapter 20, you have the first 10 verses are the empty tomb. Then verses 11 through 18 are the appearance to Mary. So that's the first appearance. Then verses 19 through 23 are his appearance to the 12, Peter included in them. Then verses 24 to 29 are his appearance to the 12 again, but specifically with Thomas there. And then notice, John originally ended it. Now Jesus, verse 30, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book, but these are written that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through this belief you may have life in his name. And then he ended it. Then he suddenly writes a second chapter, and we know it's him because the wording, the text, everything, how it's written is exactly the same author's hand. So why, right? Why does he add something after he's clearly done? The assumption is, of most scholars and sort of the information we have from other places, is between chapter 20 and 21, John is dying quickly. And he'll be the last. He's the last. He has been the last. 40 years. He's been the last living apostle of the 12. And we know from his letters that a lot of his churches were having problems. And so what John does is he puts forth finally the appearance to Peter for the purpose of reminding his flock, of whom he'll soon be dead, that they need to turn to Peter in this problems they're having, that he is the leader, right? Because that's the story that feed my sheep, feed my lambs, all the things. What's also odd about it, and why it's clearly an earlier story, although we don't know where earlier, is chapter 21 then starts very odd. It says, after this, so it's almost like the author wants to start over again, right? After this, Jesus revealed himself again to his disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and then he revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, they're all there, and Simon says, let's go, I'm going fishing. They said, we'll come with you. Right? It's just weird in itself. It sounds like this is a story that takes place after the crucifixion, before, right? Because if you had already seen Jesus 3 times, you think you'd just be like, let's go back to what we were doing. That's what the story implies. And that's why he's restored to peace, right? Because he has to come back to who he was called to be, Peter. It's also odd because it throws things off sometimes. It says, verse 14, this was now the 3rd time Jesus was revealed to his disciples after being raised from the dead. But notice it's not, it's the 4th, which means John doesn't actually include Mary as one of the appearances, even though he gives it. I should say as a church founding appearance. And so a lot about the story is odd. So I just point that out. Whether it was Mary or Peter, we don't know. It's not to deny Mary saw him. We're going to see John is the one who describes it in most detail. But just to know it's not as simple as people say it. The women saw him. Not clearly. In 2 of the Gospels, they didn't. So that only gives us 2 out of the 4 already we're down to. And see what they say. Now, what do they say? Well, all 4 accounts include, you can have this word for your next cocktail party, right? An angelophany just means an angelic appearance, a messenger's appearance. There's an appearance of an angel or 2 who come to the tomb. The basic story is the same. The women came to Jesus' tomb after the Sabbath on the first day of the week as it was dawning. So remember, Sabbath time, if you go to, if you have your Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, very quickly, but you'll notice this. As God creates, verse 5, evening came, morning followed, the first day. The second half of verse 8, evening came, morning followed, the second day. Verse 13, evening came, morning followed, the 3rd day, etc., etc. Do you notice the pattern though? Evening, then morning. So Sabbath starts Friday evening at sundown and ends Saturday evening at sundown. And so Mary and the other women are coming early morning. The Sabbath is over. They now can touch a dead body. They can do the things they need to do. And they're coming at the earliest time there would have been some light that they could see stuff. Now, already we have a problem, though, in the sense of there's a discrepancy. If you look down at the footnote 29, Mary Magdalene is the only one who's mentioned by all 4 authors. The other women vary. So we don't even know which women were there concretely. And I put what each says. Matthew has, quote, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Mark tells us it was Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Now we think that's 3 people. It might be 2, 3, 4. That's because in Greek, there's no separation between words and there's no grammatical lines. So we have Mary Magdalene and then Mary, but whether Mary is also the same person as the mother of James, we think so, but we're not certain. And Salome could either be James's sister and therefore Mary is her mother too, or a whole different person, or the mother of James could be a whole different person. So you could have Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, Salome. We don't know. Right? We just simply don't know. Luke gives us the largest group. He says it was all the women who had come from Galilee with him. And he mentions 3 of them. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, who we haven't heard about yet, and then Mary, the mother of James. So Mary, the mother of James, seems to be a constant as well, at least to those 3. But then we get to John, and John tells us it was only Mary Magdalene. There were no other women with her. She was all by herself. So you have all the different ideas. Now for John, that's not unusual because John likes to pull the literary device of corporate personality, right? He likes to have individuals who stand for groups. And so it's not surprising that he mentions Mary Magdalene singularly, because then later in his text it'll say we. So obviously he knew there probably were other women. Similarly, you see a similar thing where when Mary tells them in John's gospel, John and Peter run to the tomb and look at it. In Luke's gospel, only Peter goes to the tomb. But then later, when the disciples of Emmaus are telling Jesus about what happened, they say several of the brothers went to the tomb. So the authors, they like to trick us, right? Just like follow the ball sometimes. But just be aware that we have these differences from the tradition itself. Let's go ahead and take our break, and we'll come back and finish up Mary's.
So like,